I never understood why my husband became so protective of his phone until I saw him kissing my best friend of 12 years in our favorite restaurant, the same restaurant where he proposed to me. Watching Daniel and Sophia laughing together, as they planned their new life, everything suddenly made perfect sense. The late nights, the suspicious business trips, the way Sophia always asked about our marriage problems, my best friend and husband had orchestrated the perfect betrayal. What they didn't realize was that their moment of triumph would soon become their greatest regret. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn rain tapped against the windows of Bellini's, creating a melancholic backdrop to what was supposed to be a routine Friday evening. At 34, I had settled into the comfortable rhythm of an 8-year marriage that I believed was weathering its normal ups and downs. Looking back, I should have recognized the signs: Daniel's increasing emotional distance, the mysterious text, messages that made him smile in ways I hadn't seen in months, Sophia's sudden interest in his work schedule. My husband and I had chosen to meet at Bellini's that evening to discuss what he called important changes in our relationship. I assumed he meant the counseling I'd been suggesting, or perhaps the vacation we'd been postponing for years. I arrived 15 minutes early, the gold watch he'd given me for our 5th anniversary still adorning my wrist despite the growing distance between us. The maitre d' greeted me with a familiarity born from countless anniversaries and birthdays celebrated in these same walls. "Mrs. Reynolds, lovely to see you again. Your table isn't quite ready, but the bar is available." I nodded, making my way through the dimly lit restaurant toward the copper-topped bar in the back. That's when I saw them. Not at the bar, but tucked into a corner booth that provided the illusion of privacy. Daniel's hand rested on Sophia's, his wedding ring catching the amber light as he leaned forward to kiss her. The world narrowed to that single point of contact, his lips on hers, her hand reaching up to caress his face with the comfortable intimacy of a long-established relationship. My best friend and my husband, locked in a moment that erased 8 years of marriage and 12 years of friendship in an instant. I stood frozen, my purse clutched against my chest like armor. Around me, other diners continued their conversations. Silverware clinked against china, and waiters glided between tables, all oblivious to the implosion of my life happening in the corner booth. They hadn't noticed me yet, these two people who knew me better than anyone. Daniel threw his head back in laughter at something Sophia said, his face more animated than it had been with me in months. Sophia's hand now rested possessively on his forearm, her ruby ring, the one I'd helped her husband James select before. Their divorce, glinting in the candlelight. "Mrs. Reynolds?" The maitre d's voice broke through my trance. "Your table is ready now." Daniel's head snapped up at the sound of my name, his eyes widening as they met mine across the restaurant. Sophia turned slowly, her expression shifting from confusion to recognition, to a carefully composed mask of guilt that didn't quite reach her eyes. I had imagined this moment countless times over the past few months as my suspicions grew. The confrontation, the shouting, perhaps even a dramatic scene involving a glass of wine and Sophia's white cashmere sweater. Instead, I felt an eerie calm descend, my mind suddenly clear and focused in a way it hadn't been in years. "Actually," I said to the maitre d', my voice steady, "I believe my husband is already here, with my best friend." I nodded toward their table. The poor man's face flushed with embarrassment. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Reynolds. I didn't realize—" "Neither did I," I replied, already moving toward their table, pulled by a force beyond conscious thought. Daniel stood awkwardly as I approached, his confident executive demeanor replaced by the furtive guilt of a teenager caught breaking curfew. "Allison," he began, "this isn't what you think, isn't it?" My voice remained calm, almost curious. "Because it looks like my husband and my best friend are having a romantic dinner in the restaurant where we celebrated our engagement." Sophia shifted in her seat, her designer dress, one I'd complimented just last month during our regular lunch, suddenly seeming like a costume. "Allie, we were going to tell you. We didn't want you to find out this way." "How considerate," I said, noticing how my hand didn't tremble as I placed my purse on their table. "And when exactly were you planning this revelation? Before or after my birthday party that you insisted on planning, Sophia?" The mention of the party, scheduled for the following weekend, caused a flicker of discomfort to cross her carefully Botoxed brow. They had planned to tell me then, I realized. A public announcement at my own celebration, cushioned by friends and family to prevent the scene they feared. Daniel cleared his throat, slipping into the mediator role he'd perfected in the corporate boardroom. "Let's not do this here, Allison. We can talk privately like adults." "Like adults," I repeated, tasting the irony of those words. "You mean like the adults who've been lying to me for how long exactly?" My gaze shifted between them, noting how they unconsciously mirrored each other's posture, a sign of intimacy I recognized from my psychology practice. "It's complicated," Sophia offered, her voice taking on the soothing tone she used with her therapy clients. Before becoming my best friend, she had been a patient in my practice, seeking help after her divorce. I had guided her through her pain, never imagining she would become the architect of mine. "Actually, it's remarkably simple," I countered, removing the gold watch from my wrist and placing it on the table. "You two have been having an affair. You were planning to announce it at my birthday party, and now that charade is unnecessary." Daniel reached for my arm. "Allie, please." I stepped back, avoiding his touch. "You know what's interesting about betrayal, Daniel? It's not just the act itself, but the planning it requires, the lies, the moments you chose her over me, over and over again." Something shifted in the air between us, a recognition, perhaps, that I wasn't reacting as expected. The hysteria they had prepared for, the emotional breakdown they had strategized around, wasn't materializing. Instead, they faced a woman they suddenly realized they didn't know as well as they thought. "I want a divorce," I said simply. "Immediate and complete." Daniel's relief was palpable, quickly masked by a performed concern. "If that's what you want, but we should discuss." "There's nothing to discuss. You've already made your choices." I turned to Sophia, who had remained unnaturally still. "You always said I was too forgiving, too willing to see the good in people. Thank you for curing me of that weakness." I picked up my purse, conscious of the other diners who had begun to notice our tableau. "Enjoy your dinner. I recommend the Chianti. It pairs well with betrayal." As I walked away, head high and steps measured, I heard Daniel call my name. I didn't turn back. The restaurant door closed behind me with a soft finality, the autumn rain washing over me as I stepped onto the sidewalk. In that moment, standing in the rain outside Bellini's, something crystallized within me. This wouldn't be a story of a woman destroyed by betrayal. This would be a story of calculated consequences, of justice served not in the heat of emotion, but through the cold precision of patience. I looked back through the restaurant window, watching Daniel and Sophia in an animated discussion, likely already spinning this encounter into a narrative where they were the reasonable ones, the true victims of circumstance and passion. They thought this was the end of my story. They were wrong. This was just the beginning. The drive home from Bellini's passed in a blur, streetlights smearing across my windshield like watercolors on wet canvas. My hands gripped the steering wheel with unnecessary force, knuckles white against the black leather. I didn't cry. The absence of tears surprised me more than the betrayal itself. Rain continued to fall as I pulled into the driveway of what had been our home, a colonial revival we'd purchased 3 years ago in the prestigious Oakwood neighborhood. Daniel had insisted on this house, with its perfectly manicured lawn and proximity to the country club where he networked with clients. I had wanted something smaller, more intimate. Another battle I had conceded in the war of compromise that, defined our marriage. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Inside, the house felt different, as if the walls themselves had witnessed the destruction of everything they contained. I moved through rooms that suddenly seemed like a museum to a relationship that no longer existed. Photos of Daniel and me on the mantel, the antique vase Sophia had given us as a housewarming gift, the matching bathrobes hanging in our master bathroom. I poured myself a glass of the expensive Bordeaux Daniel saved for special occasions and sat at our kitchen island, opening my laptop with deliberate calm. First, I changed all my passwords, email, social media, bank accounts. Then I forwarded all communications from Sophia over the past year to a new folder. Finally, I logged into our shared accounts, methodically documenting balances and transactions. My phone buzzed incessantly. Daniel, then Sophia, then Daniel again. I silenced it without reading their messages, focusing instead on the task at hand. This precise documentation felt like building a raft in rising floodwaters, giving me something tangible to cling to while emotions churned beneath the surface. At midnight, I called my older sister, Rachel. "Allie?" Her voice was thick with sleep. "What's wrong?" "Daniel and Sophia are having an affair," I said, the words sounding strange in the empty kitchen. "I caught them together at Bellini's tonight." "Sophia? Your Sophia?" The disbelief in her voice mirrored what I had felt hours earlier. "I'm coming over." "No," I said firmly. "I need to be alone tonight. I just wanted you to know before they start spinning their version." Rachel's silence spoke volumes. She had never particularly liked Daniel, tolerating him with the cool politeness. That was her specialty. "What do you need from me?" "Can you recommend a good divorce attorney?" As a corporate lawyer, Rachel moved in circles filled with legal specialists. "I'll send you 3 names tomorrow morning, the best in the city." She paused. "Allie, are you sure you're okay to be alone?" "I'm not alone," I said, surprising myself with the conviction in my voice. "I have clarity for the first time in years." After hanging up, I walked through the house again, this time with purpose. In our home office, I located the file containing our prenuptial agreement, Daniel's insistence, ironically. In the guest bedroom closet, I found the box of journals I'd kept throughout our marriage, psychological breadcrumbs that would now serve a different purpose. By 3 a.m, I had systematically photographed important documents, backed up my computer to an external drive, and made a detailed inventory of items I had brought into the marriage. The methodical work kept the tidal wave of emotion at bay, transforming hurt into action, betrayal into purpose. When dawn broke, I was sitting on our back patio, watching the garden emerge from darkness. The roses Daniel had planted for our 5th anniversary bloomed in defiant crimson against the morning mist. I would miss this garden. My phone had 37 missed calls and 22 text messages. I scrolled through them without opening any, noting the progression from Daniel's initial, "We need to talk," to increasingly desperate, "Please answer me," and finally, "I'm coming home." Sophia's messages followed a similar pattern, beginning with, "Let me explain," and ending with, "You're scaring us." I smiled at that last one. Good. They should be scared. The sound of a car in the driveway pulled me from my thoughts. Daniel, still. In last night's clothes, his usual polished appearance rumpled from what had clearly been a sleepless night. I remained seated as he entered through the back door, his face a mask of rehearsed contrition. "Allie," he began, his voice taking on, the gentle tone he used with difficult clients. "I know you're hurt. Hurt doesn't begin to cover it," I interrupted, my voice steady. "But that's not important now. What's important is what happens next." He seemed thrown by my composure, having prepared for tears or rage. "I never meant for this to happen. Sophia and I—" "How long?" I asked simply. His hesitation told me everything. A year, he finally admitted. Maybe a little more. A year. While I was planning our anniversary trip to Santorini, while Sophia was helping me choose what to pack, suggesting lingerie I now realized had never been for my husband's eyes. I want you out of the house today, I said, standing up. I've already contacted a divorce attorney. Given the prenup and the circumstances, this should be straightforward. Daniel's expression shifted from contrition to calculation. The prenup has a fidelity clause that works both ways, Allie. You'd have to prove the affair. I laughed then, the sound startling us both. Are you suggesting that after I caught you with my best friend, after you just admitted to a year-long affair, you're going to contest this? I'm just saying we should be reasonable, he replied, lawyer mode fully engaged now. No one needs to get hurt more than they already are. That's where you're wrong, I said, moving past him toward the house. This isn't about hurt anymore. This is about consequences. Inside, I retrieved a small recorder from beneath the patio cushion where I'd placed it before his arrival. His admission of the affair now preserved for my attorney. The next several hours unfolded with surreal efficiency. Daniel packed essentials while making calls I pretended not to hear, to Sophia, to his law partner, to a real estate agent friend, who could help him find temporary housing. I moved through the house like a ghost, documenting everything with my phone camera, creating a digital inventory of the life we were dismantling. By afternoon, friends had begun calling, mutual friends who had somehow already heard. I let these go to voicemail too, curious about which version of events was circulating. A text from my colleague at the psychology practice offered unconditional support and coverage for my patients. Another from Sophia's sister expressed confused apologies. As Daniel carried his last suitcase to the car, he paused in the doorway. I never wanted to hurt you, he said, the platitude hanging hollow between us. And yet you made thousands of choices that led exactly to that outcome, I replied. Goodbye, Daniel. The door closed behind him with a finality that should have broken me. Instead, I felt the first stirrings of something unexpected. Not closure, not even anger, but a cold, clear purpose that would soon become a plan. That evening, alone in my bedroom, I finally allowed myself to feel the full magnitude of their betrayal. The tears came at last, not in the hysterical sobs they might have expected, but in silent streams that carried away the last vestiges of the woman I had been. By morning, that woman would be gone completely, replaced by someone they wouldn't recognize, someone they would soon have every reason to fear. 3 days after discovering Daniel and Sophia together, I sat across from Valerie Chen, the divorce attorney my sister had recommended. Her corner office in the city's financial district offered a panoramic view of the skyline Daniel had always admired. Now that same view would frame the dismantling of our marriage. The good news, Valerie said, reviewing my documents with practiced efficiency, is that your prenuptial agreement is ironclad, especially with evidence of infidelity. The bad news is that divorces like this get messy in ways contracts can't prevent. I nodded, having spent my professional life helping patients navigate emotional battlefields. I understand, but I'm not interested in a drawn-out emotional war. Valerie looked up, her dark eyes assessing me with professional curiosity. Most clients say that initially. Then the reality sets in. The mutual friends choosing sides, the division of lives intertwined for years, the inevitable public nature of private pain. I'm not most clients, I replied, sliding the recorder across her polished desk. I've documented everything, including Daniel's admission of the affair. I want this handled with surgical precision, not emotional indulgence. A slight smile crossed Valerie's face. Surgical precision is my specialty, Dr. Reynolds. But I should warn you that your husband has already consulted with Harrison Wells. The name registered immediately. Harrison had a reputation for aggressive divorce proceedings that often spilled into ugly public battles. That doesn't sound like surgical precision. No, Valerie agreed. It sounds like someone preparing for war rather than resolution. I left Valerie's office with a clear strategy and a growing realization. Daniel wasn't seeking a clean break. He was posturing for a battle he thought he could win. His choice of attorney signaled something I should have recognized years ago. Daniel viewed conflict as a competition, not a problem to be solved. Rain had started again as I walked to my car, the sky darkening to match my thoughts. My phone buzzed with a text from Sophia. "Please meet me. We need to talk." Deleted without reply. Instead of driving home, I found myself parking outside my psychology practice. The familiar brick building had been my professional home for 8 years, longer than my marriage had lasted. Inside, my colleague Mark looked up from his desk, surprise and concern crossing his features. "Allie, we weren't expecting you back yet." "Just picking up some files," I said, moving toward my office. "How are my patients doing with the temporary reassignments?" Mark followed, hovering in my doorway. "They're managing. Everyone understands. You need time." He hesitated. "We've all heard, Allie. I'm so sorry." I nodded, unlocking my filing cabinet and retrieving several folders. "Thank you, but I'm handling it." "If you need anything—" "Actually," I interrupted, making a decision I hadn't planned. "I do. I need to take a leave of absence. 3 months." His eyebrows rose in surprise. In 8 years, I'd never taken more than 2 weeks away from my practice. "Of course, whatever you need. Is there anything else I can do?" The question hung between us, loaded with unspoken offers of emotional support. Mark had been my mentor before becoming my colleague. He knew better than most how deeply I valued the stability of my professional identity. "Yes," I said finally. "If Daniel or Sophia contact the office looking for me, I'd appreciate discretion about my whereabouts." Understanding dawned in his eyes. "Complete confidentiality. Consider it done." Back in my car, I made 2 more calls, first to my bank to open a new account under my maiden name, then to a real estate agent to discuss short-term housing options. The rational part of my brain, the therapist who had guided countless patients through personal crises, recognized these actions as self-protective measures. The newer, colder part recognized them as the first moves in a game Daniel didn't yet realize we were playing. I drove to the small lake house my parents had left. Me, a modest retreat an hour outside the city that Daniel had always considered beneath us. We'd visited only twice during our marriage, Daniel complaining about the spotty cell service and lack of amenities. I'd kept it anyway, using it occasionally for personal retreats. Now it would serve a different purpose. The cabin smelled of pine and disuse as I unlocked the door, afternoon light filtering through dusty windows onto the simple furnishings. I moved through the rooms, opening windows, assessing what would be needed for an extended stay. This place represented everything Daniel had encouraged me to outgrow: modest comforts, quiet solitude, connections to my life before him, on the by. Small desk in the bedroom, I spread out the materials I'd gathered: financial documents, phone records, the recorder, and a leather-bound journal I'd started the night after Bellini's. Staring at this collection of evidence and intention, I felt something crystallize within me, a decision point beyond the practical steps of divorce. Daniel and Sophia hadn't just betrayed my trust, they had systematically dismantled the foundations of my life while pretending to support them. The affair was just the culmination of a longer pattern of manipulation and disrespect. My professional training had taught me the importance of processing trauma, of moving through grief toward acceptance and healing. But healing wasn't what I wanted now. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Sophia, followed immediately by one from Daniel. "Harrison says we need to discuss division of assets. Let's be reasonable about this." Reasonable. The word ignited something cold and clarifying. They expected reason from me now, after a year of calculated deception. They wanted a clean, civilized conclusion to their betrayal, a straightforward divorce that would leave them free to build their new life together, while I picked up the pieces of mine. Standing in the fading light of my parents' cabin, I made a decision that would reshape everything that followed. This wouldn't be just about divorce or legal separation of assets. This would be about consequences, methodical, calculated consequences that would dismantle their new beginning just as thoroughly as they had dismantled my trust. I opened my laptop and created a new document titled Strategy. As a psychologist, I understood human vulnerability better than most. The pressure points, the fault lines, the carefully constructed self-images that people built their lives around. Daniel and Sophia had betrayed me using my trust and openness against me. Now I would use my professional insights to ensure they experienced the full weight of their choices. The plan that took shape over the next few hours wasn't born of hot-blooded revenge, but of cold, clinical assessment. Daniel's professional reputation, built on an image of integrity and trustworthiness. Sophia's therapy practice, dependent on the perception of ethical behavior and emotional stability. Their social standing, their financial security, their carefully curated public narrative, all of it rested on foundations more fragile than they realized. By midnight, I had drafted a comprehensive strategy, not just for the divorce, but for what would come after. Steps that would be implemented not in the heat of emotion, but with the patience of a physician monitoring a long-term treatment plan. Each action would build on the previous, creating a cascade of consequences that would unfold with inevitable precision. I closed the laptop, a strange calm settling over me. Outside, an owl called into the darkness, its voice echoing across the still lake. Tomorrow, I would begin gathering what I needed: resources, information, allies who didn't yet know they would serve my purpose. Daniel and Sophia thought they knew me. The forgiving therapist, the accommodating wife, the friend who always put others first. That was their first mistake. Their second was believing that my silence meant acceptance, that my apparent calm meant surrender. They were about to discover just how wrong they had been on both counts. The lake house became my war room over the next 2 weeks. I transformed the simple living space into an operational headquarters, with charts, timelines, and documents covering every available surface. The kitchen table disappeared beneath financial records and property valuations. The living room walls held detailed maps of Daniel and Sophia's professional networks, annotated with connections and vulnerabilities I'd identified. My first priority was financial independence. Daniel had always managed our major investments, a dynamic I'd accepted despite my own financial acumen. Now, that misplaced trust would be corrected. I hired Margot Winters, a forensic accountant recommended by Valerie, to conduct a comprehensive audit of our marital finances. "You're more prepared than most clients," Margot observed during our initial meeting at the lake house, surveying my organized documentation. "Most people in your situation can barely find their tax returns." "I've always been detail-oriented," I replied, not mentioning the 3 sleepless nights I'd spent combing through 5 years of financial statements. "I'm particularly interested in any unusual transactions over the past 18 months. Margot's findings came faster than expected. Daniel had been siphoning money into a separate account for 11 months, small amounts that wouldn't trigger attention, but substantial in aggregate. Nearly $47,000 moved through a complex series of transfers. "Classic preparation for separation," Margot explained, highlighting the transactions. He was building a financial cushion while maintaining plausible deniability. This discovery sparked the first genuine rage I'd allowed myself to feel. Not just the betrayal with Sophia, but this calculated financial infidelity, planning his escape while sleeping beside me each night. I channeled that anger into methodical documentation for Valerie, evidence that would strengthen my position in the divorce proceedings. My next focus was information. Daniel's law practice specialized in corporate mergers and acquisitions, work that required absolute client confidence. As his spouse, I'd been privy to conversations, client names, and occasional ethical gray areas he'd navigated over the years. I compiled these recollections meticulously, not for immediate use but as potential leverage if needed. Sophia presented a different challenge. As a therapist herself, she understood professional boundaries and ethical obligations. But her therapy practice catered to the city's elite, executives, politicians, and their spouses who valued both her expertise and her discretion. Her professional reputation hinged on the perception of absolute integrity. I began researching complaints filed with the state licensing board, paying particular attention to cases involving therapists who had engaged in inappropriate personal relationships. The precedents were illuminating, the consequences severe. I stored this information carefully, another arrow in a quiver I was steadily filling. Social reconnaissance came next. I created a spreadsheet of our shared social circle, categorizing each person by their likely loyalty in the coming conflict. Close friends of Daniel, potential adversaries. My personal friends, probable allies. The many acquaintances who fell, between unknown variables to be assessed individually. Rachel called daily, increasingly concerned about my prolonged isolation. "No one's seen you in weeks, Allie. People are worried." "I need this time," I assured her, not mentioning the strategic advantage my absence created. Let Daniel and Sophia control the initial narrative. Let them believe I was hiding in shame or grief. Their assumptions would become their vulnerability. "At least tell me what you're planning," Rachel pressed. "I know that tone in your voice. You're not just processing, you're plotting." "I'm preparing," I corrected her. "There's a difference." By the third week, my preparation expanded beyond documentation to active reconnaissance. I purchased a prepaid phone and created email accounts under a pseudonym, establishing digital distance between my actions and my identity. I set up alerts for Daniel's name in legal publications and business journals, created Google alerts for Sophia's therapy practice, and began monitoring social media through anonymous accounts. The first useful intelligence came from an unexpected source, Jessica, the receptionist at Daniel's law firm, who had always been friendly during office parties. Over coffee at a cafe far from Daniel's usual haunts, she provided valuable insights in exchange for sympathetic listening. "Everyone at the firm knows," she confided, stirring her latte nervously. "They're not even being subtle about it. Sophia visits him for lunch at least twice a week. They think it's romantic, but most of us think it's sleazy how they went behind your back." "Has it affected his standing at the firm?" I asked, careful to maintain a tone of casual curiosity rather than tactical interest. Jessica leaned closer. "The senior partners are concerned about appearances. Reynolds and Whitman represents a lot of traditional corporate clients who value family stability. A messy divorce involving a client's therapist isn't exactly the image they want. This nugget of information was worth far more than the coffee I'd bought Jessica. Daniel's position as junior partner had been his crowning achievement, the culmination of years of strategic networking and carefully cultivated client relationships. Any threat to that status would strike at the heart of his self-image. My preparation extended to physical changes as well. I cut my honey blonde hair, which Daniel had always preferred long, into a sleek shoulder-length style. I replaced my muted conservative wardrobe, largely influenced by Daniel's preferences for a lawyer's wife, with sharper, more confident pieces that reflected my emerging identity. The external transformation mirrored the internal one. I was shedding the accommodating persona I'd adopted within our marriage. At the 1-month mark, Valerie called with news. "Daniel's attorney has proposed mediation instead of proceeding directly to litigation. It seems your husband is having second thoughts about Harrison Wells' aggressive approach." "What changed?" I asked, though I had my suspicions. Apparently, some of the firm's senior partners expressed concerns about a public, contentious divorce. They're suggesting a more discreet resolution. I smiled at the validation of Jessica's intelligence. And what do you recommend? Normally, I'd say mediation benefits both parties, Valerie replied. But given the financial discoveries and the circumstances of infidelity, we're negotiating from a position of strength. We could push for more favorable terms. Accept the mediation, I decided after a moment of consideration. But make no concessions on the financial disclosure requirements. The tactical advantage was clear. Mediation would provide a controlled environment to present the evidence I'd gathered, particularly the hidden financial transfers. More importantly, it would create the impression that I was seeking an amicable resolution, establishing a public record of my reasonableness that would serve me well later. By the end of the 6th week, my preparation phase was complete. I had assembled comprehensive dossiers on both Daniel and Sophia, their vulnerabilities, professional pressure points, and social weaknesses. I had secured my financial position, established legal advantage, and created the strategic foundation for what would come next. The final element of preparation was psychological. As a therapist, I understood the power of perception and expectation. I arranged to be seen at a popular restaurant near Daniel's office, engaging in animated conversation with a male colleague. I accepted a carefully selected charity gala invitation, where I knew several of Daniel's clients would be present. I updated my professional headshot and biography on the practice website, removing all references to my married status. These calculated appearances served multiple purposes, signaling to our social circle that I wasn't in hiding, creating uncertainties in Daniel and Sophia's minds about my emotional state, and establishing the public narrative that I was moving forward with dignity rather than dwelling in victimhood. The evening before the scheduled mediation, I stood on the lake house dock, watching the sunset reflect across the water my parents had so loved. The woman who had discovered her husband's betrayal 6 weeks earlier had been transformed, not by time or healing, but by purpose and preparation. Tomorrow would mark the first visible move in a game Daniel and Sophia didn't realize had already begun. They expected a negotiation about the past. They would instead face the first consequence of their future. I was no longer preparing. I was ready. The mediation took place in a neutral conference room at a downtown business center, all muted tones and uncomfortable elegance. I arrived 15 minutes early, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that projected confidence without aggression. Valerie nodded approvingly as we reviewed our strategy one final time. "Remember," she said, arranging documents in precise stacks before us, "mediation is as much theater as negotiation. Perception matters almost as much as legal positioning." Daniel arrived with Harrison Wells exactly on time, his expression a carefully composed mask of professional detachment. He'd lost weight, I noticed dispassionately, the collar of his dress shirt slightly loose around his neck. The wedding band was already gone from his left hand, a detail I filed away without visible reaction. "Allison?" He nodded, his voice pitched to convey both regret and reasonableness. "You look well." "Thank you," I replied with the polite neutrality I'd practiced. "Shall we begin?" The mediator, a silver-haired former judge named Eleanor Barnes, established ground rules with practiced efficiency. "This process works best when both parties approach it with openness and good faith," she explained, her gaze moving between us. "Today's goal is to establish a framework for equitable distribution of assets and to identify any areas of significant disagreement." What followed was a masterclass in strategic disclosure. Valerie presented our position with measured precision, acknowledging areas of potential agreement before introducing the forensic accounting report. The revelation of Daniel's secret financial maneuvers shifted the room's dynamics immediately. "My client was unaware of these transfers," Harrison began, but Daniel's expression had already betrayed him. A momentary widening of the eyes, a slight flush creeping up his neck. "We're simply establishing a complete financial picture, Valerie," responded smoothly. "Dr. Reynolds wants transparency as the foundation of these proceedings." By the midpoint break, the advantage had clearly shifted. Daniel huddled with Harrison in the hallway, their urgent whispers carrying tones of recalibration. I remained in my seat, reviewing documents with Valerie while projecting calm focus. "He's rattled," Valerie murmured. "Wells didn't expect this level of preparation. He thought I'd be emotional, not strategic," I replied, a common miscalculation. When the session resumed, Daniel adopted a more conciliatory approach, agreeing to several of our proposed terms regarding property division. The lake house, which he had previously claimed interest in despite his disdain for it, was conceded without argument. The investment portfolio would be divided along the lines we had proposed, with additional compensation for the undisclosed transfers. "My client is prepared to be generous in the interest of an amicable resolution," Harrison stated, attempting to reframe Daniel's retreat as magnanimity. I maintained my composed silence, allowing Valerie to handle the legal maneuvering while I observed Daniel's micro-expressions. Each concession physically pained him, the slight tightening around his mouth, the tension in his shoulders. His need to win warring with his desire to conclude these proceedings quickly. As the session neared its end, I made my first direct address to Daniel. "There's one more item not on the formal agenda," I said, my voice level. "I'd like my patient records returned." Confusion flickered across his face. "Patient records? I don't have any of your patient files." "Not my current patients," I clarified. "The therapy notes from Sophia's sessions before we became friends. They were in my home office. They're missing now." The calculated precision of this request hit its mark perfectly. Daniel's face drained of color as the mediator and Harrison both turned to him with sharp attention. "Are you suggesting Mr. Reynolds took confidential patient records?" Harrison asked, alarm evident in his tone. "I'm not suggesting anything," I replied calmly. "I'm simply stating that legally protected confidential patient documentation is missing from my home office, and I need it returned immediately to avoid potential ethical and legal violations." The mediator's expression had shifted from neutral to concerned. "Mr. Reynolds, this is a serious matter. Confidential patient records are protected by both HIPAA and state regulations." Daniel's composure cracked further. "I didn't," he began, then stopped, recalibrating. "I'll check the home office. Perhaps they were moved during recent activities." "I would appreciate that," I responded with professional courtesy. The regulatory consequences of mishandled patient records can be quite severe. This strategic mention of regulatory consequences completed what the financial disclosures had begun. By the session's end, we had secured favorable terms on every substantive issue, with Daniel agreeing to expedite the property division and financial settlements. As we gathered our materials, Daniel attempted a private word. "Allie, can we speak for a moment? Just the two of us." I met his gaze directly for the first time that day. "I don't think that would be productive, Daniel. All communication should go through our attorneys from this point forward." The controlled formality of my response seemed to unsettle him more than anger would have. "This isn't like you," he said, lowering his voice. "This calculated approach. I know you're hurt, but—" "You don't know me at all," I interrupted, my voice still measured, but carrying an undercurrent of absolute certainty. "That's becoming increasingly clear." I left him standing there, his rehearsed script of reconciliation undelivered. Outside, in the brightness of midday, Valerie allowed herself a small smile of professional satisfaction. "That was exceptionally well executed," she said as we walked to her car. "Particularly the patient records issue. Was that planned?" "Sophia's old therapy records are secured in my office at the practice," I confirmed. "But Daniel doesn't know that. His reaction tells us he and Sophia have been worried about exactly that potential vulnerability. Valerie's smile widened with appreciation for the tactic. Creating uncertainty about what evidence you might hold. Very effective. My next move came that evening. After careful consideration, I crafted a brief, factual email to the ethics committee at Sophia's professional association. I did not make specific allegations. That would come later if necessary. Instead, I requested confidential guidance regarding the appropriate professional response when a therapist becomes romantically involved with the spouse of a former patient, potentially while that therapeutic relationship was still active. This inquiry would create no immediate consequences, but would establish a timestamp and record of my ethical concerns. More importantly, it would trigger internal protocols that would flag Sophia's name in the association system. The following day, I took my first public step. After weeks of digital silence, I updated my professional social media profile, removing my married name and posting a thoughtful article I'd written for a psychology journal about professional ethics and personal boundaries. The timing and topic were deliberate, establishing my voice as a respected authority on the very ethical guidelines Sophia had violated. Within hours, mutual colleagues began reaching out, first with sympathy about my situation, then with professional admiration for the article. I responded graciously to both, neither confirming nor denying the swirling rumors about my marriage. This calculated ambiguity forced others to fill in the blanks, creating a narrative momentum beyond my direct control, but precisely aligned with my strategic objectives. That weekend, I attended a fundraising event for the Community Mental Health Center where I volunteered monthly. I knew several board members from Daniel's firm would be present, along with key figures from the local therapy community. I arrived alone, dressed impeccably, and navigated the social complexities with practiced poise. "Allison, we've missed you," said Margaret Winters, the center director and a longtime professional acquaintance. "I heard about—" "Well, I'm so sorry." "Thank you," I replied with the perfect balance of acknowledgement and dignity. "Life presents unexpected challenges sometimes. I'm focusing on my practice and my volunteer work here." This measured response set the tone for the evening. I neither avoided mentioning Daniel nor dwelled on the situation, creating the impression of someone handling adversity with grace. By evening's end, I had reconnected with key professional contacts, volunteered for a prestigious committee position, and established myself as someone moving forward rather than breaking down. These first strategic steps, the successful mediation, the ethics committee inquiry, the professional repositioning, and the calibrated social reemergence, created the foundation for everything that would follow. Each move was measured, each action designed to advance multiple objectives simultaneously. Daniel and Sophia had expected the typical progression of a betrayed spouse: emotional outbursts followed by desperate negotiation, public displays of hurt followed by reluctant acceptance. Instead, they faced a carefully orchestrated campaign that had already begun reshaping the landscape around them in ways they had yet to fully comprehend. The first steps had been taken. The path forward was clear, and they still had no idea what was coming. Following the initial strategic moves, I entered a deliberate phase of watchful assessment. Like a chess player who has made opening gambits and now studies the board before continuing, I pulled back to observe the ripple effects of my actions and gather critical intelligence about Daniel and Sophia's responses. I established a comfortable routine at the lake house, dividing my time between limited professional obligations and methodical monitoring. Each morning began with comprehensive digital surveillance, reviewing social media updates, checking news alerts for mentions of Daniel's firm, and scanning professional forums where Sophia occasionally contributed. This digital reconnaissance provided valuable insights into their public positioning and private concerns. The results were illuminating. Daniel had accelerated his professional networking, attending more industry events than usual and increasing his visibility within legal circles. His law firm's website now prominently featured his recent casework, suggesting an attempt to reinforce his professional value amid personal turbulence. Meanwhile, Sophia had become notably less active on professional platforms, her usual confident commentary replaced by careful, minimal engagement. "She's on the defensive," Rachel noted during one of our weekly calls. My sister had become my most trusted confidant, though I shared only selected aspects of my strategy with her. Word is getting around therapy circles about her involvement. With Daniel, the timing couldn't be worse with the state board's new ethics initiative. This last piece of information was particularly valuable. The state licensing board had recently announced intensified scrutiny of boundary violations among mental health professionals. A fortunate coincidence that aligned perfectly with my measured ethics committee inquiry. Physical observation proved equally informative. I enlisted Rachel's husband, Michael, a corporate security consultant, to teach me basic surveillance techniques. These skills allowed me to occasionally monitor Daniel and Sophia's movements without detection, observing them from a careful distance at restaurants, noting their body language, identifying changes in their routines and social patterns. "Just promise me you're being careful," Michael cautioned during our training sessions, "both legally and personally." "This is about information, not intervention," I assured him. "Knowledge is leverage." What I witnessed during these observation periods told a different story than their carefully managed public appearances. The romantic dinners had become less frequent, often cut short by what appeared to be tense discussions. Daniel checked his phone constantly during these encounters, his posture increasingly defensive. Sophia's animated gestures suggested she was asking questions he couldn't or wouldn't answer satisfactorily. The strain between them became publicly visible 3 weeks after the mediation, at the annual Bar Association dinner. I didn't attend, but detailed accounts reached me through strategic contacts. Daniel and Sophia had arrived together but spent much of the evening apart. She'd left early, alone, while he remained, drinking more than was professionally advisable. "He tried to explain it away as work pressure," reported Jessica, my source at the law firm during another discreet coffee meeting. "But the timing is interesting. It was right after the senior partners called him in for a private meeting." This correlation suggested my calculated moves were creating the intended professional pressure. The senior partners, concerned about the firm's image, were clearly communicating their discomfort with Daniel's personal choices. His response, increasing work hours while trying to maintain the appearance of a blissful new relationship, was stretching him thin. Sophia's professional situation showed similar stress fractures. Through a colleague at my practice, I learned that she had lost 2 high-profile clients in recent weeks. While client departures weren't unusual in therapy, the specific clients, both connected to legal circles, indicated potential reputational damage spreading through Daniel's professional network to hers. My observations extended to financial movements as well. The forensic accountant I'd retained continued monitoring visible transactions, reporting that Daniel had liquidated a significant personal investment, likely to cover the unexpected costs of maintaining 2 households while legal proceedings continued. Sophia had listed her luxury condominium for sale, downsizing to a rental closer to her practice. These financial adjustments weren't crisis measures, but they revealed important truths. The comfortable future they had envisioned together was already compromised by the consequences of their choices. The dream of seamlessly transitioning from betrayal to happiness was encountering reality's harsh friction. My most valuable observation came unexpectedly through an accidental encounter at the city's central medical complex. I had an appointment with my primary physician in the same building where Sophia maintained her therapy practice. As I exited the elevator, I spotted Daniel waiting in the corridor outside her office, his expression troubled. When Sophia emerged, their conversation appeared tense, their body language closed and defensive. I ducked into a nearby waiting area before they noticed me, watching as their discussion escalated into a barely controlled argument. Though I couldn't hear their words, The subject became clear when Sophia thrust papers toward Daniel. Papers? Bearing the letterhead of the state licensing board. His dismissive gesture suggested he believed the issue was minor. Her rigid posture indicated she strongly disagreed. This glimpse confirmed what my strategic moves had intended. The ethics inquiry had triggered standard review procedures, creating professional concerns that were now bleeding into their personal relationship. The pressure points I had identified were proving effective. Throughout this observation period, I maintained careful distance from direct engagement. When mutual acquaintances mentioned Daniel or Sophia, I responded with neutral acknowledgement. When professional situations required reference to my changing personal status, I addressed them with composed dignity. This calculated restraint created a perception vacuum that others filled with their own interpretations, often more damaging than anything I might have said directly. My attorney provided regular updates on the divorce proceedings, which were progressing smoothly toward the terms we had established in mediation. Daniel's initial aggressive legal posture had shifted to one of expedience, his focus clearly on concluding the process quickly, rather than fighting for contested assets. "He seems eager to settle," Valerie noted during our monthly review. "That usually indicates external pressures beyond the divorce itself." By the end of this observation phase, I had compiled a comprehensive assessment of their vulnerabilities and reactions. Daniel's professional standing was compromised, but not critical. His primary concern now appeared to be damage control rather than advancement. Sophia's practice was showing signs of significant stress, with the licensing inquiry creating professional uncertainty that undermined her confidence. Most importantly, their relationship itself, the prize for which they had sacrificed my trust, was revealing fundamental instabilities. The united front they had presented initially was fracturing under pressure, exposing the weak foundation upon which they had built their future. My strategic patience had yielded exactly the intelligence I needed, confirmation of which pressure points would be most effective in the next phase, which alliances had shifted, and which vulnerabilities had deepened. The observation period had served its purpose, providing both validation of my initial strategy and clear direction for what would follow. As I compiled my findings into a detailed assessment document, I recognized that this period of watchful waiting had accomplished something equally important. It had allowed my own emotions to settle into a clear, cold certainty. The visceral pain of betrayal had been transformed into analytical determination. I was no longer acting from hurt, but from purpose. Daniel and Sophia had revealed their weaknesses. Now it was time to apply calculated pressure to those exact points. The transition from observation to active alliance building required precision timing. After 2 months of strategic positioning, I began methodically cultivating relationships that would serve my longer-term objectives. This wasn't about creating a mob with torches. It was about strategically placing dominoes that would fall at the right moment. My first priority was strengthening my professional network. I scheduled lunch with Dr. Eleanor Winters, the chair of the ethics committee who had received my inquiry about Sophia. We had known each other for years through professional circles, but our relationship had been cordial rather than close. "Allison, it's wonderful to see you," she said as we met at an upscale bistro downtown. "You're looking well, all things considered." "Thank you, Eleanor. I've found that focusing on my practice has been stabilizing," I replied, carefully establishing my narrative of professional dedication amidst personal turmoil. Throughout lunch, I kept the conversation centered on professional matters, upcoming conferences, committee initiatives, research developments. Only when coffee arrived did Eleanor gently broach personal territory. "I received your inquiry," she said, lowering her voice slightly. "I want you to know it's being handled with appropriate discretion." I nodded, my expression composed. "I appreciate that. It was a difficult letter to write, but professional ethics must transcend personal circumstances." "Absolutely," she agreed, studying me with newfound respect. "Many in your position would have filed formal charges immediately." that wouldn't serve the profession, I replied. My concern is ensuring proper protocols are followed, not pursuing personal vendettas. This carefully calibrated response accomplished exactly what I intended, positioning me as the ethical professional amid chaos not of my making. By the lunch's end, Eleanor had invited me to join the ethics committee as a special advisor on a new initiative regarding therapeutic boundaries. My second strategic alliance came through Daniel's law firm. Jessica, my source at the firm, had mentioned that Thomas Whitman, the founding partner's son and Daniel's direct superior, was seeking a psychological consultant for a high-profile custody case. I arranged to accidentally encounter Thomas at a fundraising event for the city's Legal Aid Society. Our conversation began with polite condolences about my personal situation, which I acknowledged graciously before steering the discussion toward professional matters. Actually, Thomas, I've been focusing my research on the psychological impacts of parental betrayal on children, I said, the careful phrasing making my personal connection to the topic clear without directly referencing Daniel. I'd be happy to share my findings if they might be useful to your custody case. 2 days later, his office called to schedule a consultation. The meeting was deliberately scheduled for a time when Daniel would be in the office, creating an unavoidable awkwardness that positioned Thomas to witness firsthand the professional composure I maintained despite personal betrayal. Your insights are exactly what we need for this case, Thomas said as our meeting concluded. Would you consider joining us as a formal consultant? I'd be honored, I replied, knowing this alliance would create professional proximity that would make Daniel profoundly uncomfortable while simultaneously elevating my professional standing. The third strategic relationship I cultivated was with Sophia's professional mentor, Dr. Claudia Vasquez. As the former head of Sophia's therapy practice and a respected figure in the field, her opinion carried significant weight. Our paths crossed at a conference where I was presenting research on ethical boundaries in therapeutic relationships. My presentation was meticulously crafted to discuss professional ethics in terms that inevitably evoked Sophia's situation without ever mentioning her. The examples I used, while completely anonymized, echoed the ethical questions raised by a therapist becoming involved with a client's spouse. Dr. Vasquez approached me after the presentation, her expression a careful neutral. That was excellently presented, Allison, particularly relevant in today's practice environment. Thank you, Claudia. These principles have taken on new personal significance for me recently, I replied, allowing the subtext to hang between us, over coffee afterward. Our conversation navigated the delicate territory between professional principles and personal experience. I never directly mentioned Sophia, yet her presence permeated our discussion of ethical boundaries. The committee is considering updates to the relationship guidelines, Claudia mentioned. Your perspective would be invaluable in that process. By the end of our conversation, I had secured both a speaking engagement at a major ethics conference and Claudia's tacit acknowledgement that Sophia's actions had crossed professional lines. This alliance would create significant pressure within Sophia's professional community, pressure applied not through gossip, but through principled professional discourse. The fourth strategic relationship developed more organically. Martin Chen, a prominent real estate developer and one of Daniel's most important clients, approached me at a charity gala. His wife had been one of Sophia's clients before abruptly changing therapists weeks earlier. Allison, I've been hoping to speak with you, he said, his expression carefully neutral as we stood near the bar. These situations are always complicated. I maintained my composed demeanor. Life rarely follows the paths we expect, Martin. How is Catherine? I understand she's working with Dr. Layton now. The subtle acknowledgement that I knew his wife had left Sophia's practice created an immediate connection. Over the next 30 minutes, our conversation delicately navigated shared understanding without ever directly discussing our respective spouses. By evening's end, Martin had invited me to serve on the board of his family's charitable foundation, a position previously offered to Daniel but never formalized. The invitation represented not just a professional opportunity, but a clear social realignment that would be immediately visible within our shared circles. Throughout this phase, I maintained careful distance from direct confrontation with either Daniel or Sophia. When we inevitably encountered each other at professional events, I was unfailingly polite but brief, denying them the emotional reaction they likely anticipated. This controlled demeanor created a stark contrast to their increasingly strained public appearances. The strategic alliances I cultivated during this period served multiple purposes. Professionally, they elevated my standing within the community, while simultaneously creating pressure points within both Daniel's and Sophia's professional networks. Socially, they signaled my resilience and reframed the narrative from one of victimhood to one of ethical fortitude. Each relationship was chosen with surgical precision. Individuals who held influence over Daniel and Sophia's professional trajectories, whose support would create protective networks around me while simultaneously restricting their options. These weren't friendships formed from emotional need, but strategic alignments designed with specific outcomes in mind. Perhaps most significantly, these relationships created natural channels for information flow. Through casual conversations at professional events, I gained valuable insights into the increasing pressure Daniel faced at his firm, where senior partners were growing concerned about his judgment affecting client relationships. Similarly, I learned that Sophia's practice was experiencing a quiet exodus of high-profile clients, not through any direct action on my part, but through the natural social dynamics of a close-knit professional community where ethical concerns had been subtly raised. The alliance-building phase concluded with a carefully orchestrated appearance at the annual hospital fundraising gala, an event Daniel and I had always attended together, and where he and Sophia would be making their first official appearance as a couple. I arrived alone, wearing a striking blue gown that represented a deliberate departure from the conservative style Daniel had always preferred. Throughout the evening, I moved confidently through social circles that had once been ours together, now clearly mine. When Daniel and Sophia arrived, the room's subtle shift was palpable. Their entrance, which they had perhaps imagined would make a statement about their new beginning, instead highlighted how thoroughly social alliances had already realigned. They found themselves awkwardly navigating a space where key figures, Thomas Whitman, Martin Chen, Claudia Vasquez, were now publicly aligned with me. The evening provided the perfect visual representation of what my strategic alliance building had accomplished. Daniel and Sophia stood increasingly isolated, while I moved through the room surrounded by a carefully cultivated network of professional allies and social connections. As I left the gala that evening, I caught a glimpse of them in heated discussion near the bar, their body language tense and defensive. The pressure was building precisely as I had designed it to, not through direct confrontation, but through the strategic realignment of the social and professional landscape around them. The dominoes were now in place. The next phase would set them in motion. After months of meticulous preparation, observation, and alliance building, the time had come for a more direct approach. The first major action would need to be precisely calculated, significant enough to create substantial impact, yet subtle enough to maintain my carefully constructed image of dignified professionalism. The catalyst arrived unexpectedly in the form of a USB drive delivered to my lake house by courier. The package bore no return address, only a typed note reading, "Thought you should have these. Not everyone agrees with how you've been treated." The drive contained emails between Daniel and Sophia dating back 18 months, long before I discovered their relationship at Bellini's. These weren't merely romantic exchanges, but detailed discussions of their future plans, including explicit mentions of how and when they would handle the Allison situation. Most damaging were several exchanges discussing information about Daniel's clients that Sophia had gleaned from her therapy sessions with their spouses, a profound breach of therapeutic confidentiality. I sat at my desk for hours, reviewing the contents with clinical detachment. The emails provided irrefutable evidence of both the affair's timeline and serious ethical violations, but using them presented complex considerations. The anonymous source raised legal questions about chain of custody and admissibility. More importantly, wielding this information required precision to avoid appearing vindictive rather than principled. After careful consideration, I called Valerie. I've received sensitive information that impacts both the divorce proceedings and potential ethical violations, I explained, outlining the contents without specifying how I'd obtained them. This changes our leverage considerably, Valerie observed, especially regarding the timeline of their relationship. But we need to be strategic about deployment. The plan we developed balanced legal, professional, and strategic considerations. The evidence would be used in carefully segmented ways. Certain portions relevant to the divorce would be formally submitted in those proceedings, while information regarding ethical violations would be handled through appropriate professional channels. The first major move came through the legal track. Valerie filed an amended financial disclosure statement in our divorce proceedings, citing newly discovered evidence of financial impropriety related to the timeline of extramarital activities. This legal language disguised the emotional bombshell contained in the attached emails, which clearly demonstrated that Daniel had begun transferring assets 13 months earlier than previously admitted, directly correlating with the beginning of his affair with Sophia. The filing didn't request punitive damages or make accusations beyond the financial realm. Instead, it simply presented factual evidence requiring revised settlement terms. This measured approach reinforced my image as reasonable while creating maximum legal pressure on Daniel. The impact was immediate. Harrison Wells requested an emergency meeting with Valerie, seeking to prevent the amended filing from becoming public record. Daniel's desperation to keep the emails private confirmed their authenticity and significance. He's offering substantial financial concessions, Valerie reported after the meeting, including full equity in the primary residence and additional compensation for the hidden transfers. And what does he want in exchange? I asked, already anticipating the answer. Confidentiality. Specifically, keeping the emails out of the public record and limiting their use to the divorce proceedings only. This reaction was precisely what I had anticipated. Daniel feared professional consequences more than financial ones. His attempt to contain the damage revealed his primary vulnerability and confirmed the effectiveness of my strategy. Counter with these terms, I instructed Valerie. I'll accept the enhanced financial settlement, but I require complete autonomy regarding professional ethics matters. The emails won't be filed publicly in divorce proceedings, but I retain the right to fulfill any ethical reporting obligations related to professional conduct. Daniel accepted these terms within hours, eager to resolve the immediate threat to his public image. What he failed to recognize was that I had secured exactly the leverage I needed for the professional track of my strategy. With the divorce settlement now accelerated on favorable terms, I turned to the professional consequences. Rather than filing a formal complaint against Sophia with the licensing board, a move that might appear vindictive, I instead requested a confidential consultation with the ethics committee. I find myself in a difficult position regarding professional obligations, I explained to Eleanor Winters, carefully framing my concerns. I've become aware of potential client confidentiality breaches that may require reporting under our mandatory ethics guidelines. During our meeting, I shared selected emails demonstrating Sophia's improper disclosure of client information to Daniel. I presented these not as accusations but as an ethical dilemma requiring guidance from the committee. This puts the committee in a challenging position, Eleanor acknowledged after reviewing the evidence. The violations are clear, but the source of the information raises procedural questions. I understand, I replied. My concern is fulfilling my professional obligations while ensuring proper procedures are followed. What would you recommend as the appropriate course of action? This approach accomplished several objectives simultaneously. It positioned me as the reluctant ethical professional rather than the scorned wife seeking revenge. It placed the burden of action on the committee rather than on me directly. Most importantly, it created official awareness of Sophia's violations within her professional governance structure. The committee's response was predictable. They would need to conduct a preliminary inquiry to determine whether formal investigation was warranted. This meant Sophia would be notified of potential ethics violations reported by an unnamed colleague, creating professional uncertainty without exposing me as the direct source. The third track of my first major action focused on the social realm. Through careful conversations with selected individuals in our shared social circle, I allowed certain facts about the timeline of their affair to become known without appearing to spread gossip. When Margaret Lancaster, a prominent society figure, expressed sympathy about my sudden divorce, I responded with measured precision. It wasn't as sudden as it appeared, Margaret. Daniel and Sophia had been planning their future together for quite some time before I discovered them at Bellini's. Similarly, when Thomas Whitman mentioned the unfortunate circumstances during a consultation meeting, I responded with careful understatement. The circumstances began much earlier than most people realize, Thomas. Sometimes what appears to be a momentary lapse in judgment is actually a calculated series of decisions. These conversations created ripples through our social and professional circles without requiring me to actively spread information. Others did that work for me, each retelling adding moral judgment that I had carefully avoided expressing directly. The combined effect of these coordinated actions, legal, professional, and social, created precisely the impact I had designed. Daniel found himself rushing to complete our divorce settlement on terms highly favorable to me, while simultaneously managing increasing scrutiny from the partners at his firm about his professional judgment. Sophia faced an even more direct professional threat. The Ethics Committee's preliminary inquiry required her to provide explanations for the confidentiality concerns raised, creating immediate professional jeopardy without any direct accusation from me. Most significantly, their relationship began, showing accelerating signs of strain. They appeared together less frequently at social functions, and when they did, observers noted increasing tension. The pressure I had carefully applied was causing fractures exactly where I had predicted they would emerge. Throughout this phase, I maintained my composed public persona. At professional events, I continued to present research on therapeutic, ethics, and boundaries. In social settings, I focused conversations on future plans rather than past grievances. This forward-looking demeanor contrasted sharply with Daniel and Sophia's increasingly defensive posture. By the time the Ethics Committee scheduled Sophia's preliminary hearing, the narrative had shifted significantly. What had begun as the story of a wife betrayed by her husband and best friend had transformed into a professional ethics matter involving serious boundary violations. This redefinition of the situation represented the true success of my first major action. I had moved the battlefield from the personal realm, where they had expected to face an emotional opponent, to the professional arena, where they now confronted institutional consequences for ethical breaches. The first major domino had fallen, and its momentum was now carrying forward exactly as I had designed. The weeks following my first major action witnessed a natural acceleration of consequences. Like a chemical reaction that generates its own increasing heat, the situation began to escalate beyond my direct intervention, gaining momentum and energy from the social and professional ecosystems I had carefully prepared. The most immediate escalation came from the Ethics Committee's preliminary inquiry into Sophia's conduct. What began as a confidential process quickly expanded when 3 additional former clients came forward with concerns about confidentiality breaches. This development surprised even me. I had provided evidence regarding specific violations, but these new complaints suggested a pattern of behavior beyond what I had documented. The committee has voted to elevate this to a formal investigation, Eleanor informed me during a discreet call. The initial evidence you provided opened a door, but what we're finding suggests systematic boundary issues beyond your situation. I maintained my carefully crafted position of reluctant witness. That's troubling to hear, both professionally and personally. What does this mean for the process going forward? A formal investigation requires Sophia to respond to specific allegations before a review panel. She's been instructed to limit her client contact during this period, which effectively means a partial practice suspension. This development represented a significant escalation beyond my original strategy. The professional consequences for Sophia were becoming more severe than I had initially calculated, driven now by institutional mechanisms rather than my direct actions. Daniel's professional situation escalated simultaneously through different channels. Thomas Whitman called me regarding our consulting arrangement, but the conversation quickly veered into territory I hadn't anticipated. The partnership committee has concerns about potential conflicts of interest, he explained, his tone carefully neutral. Given Daniel's access to sensitive client information and his relationship with a therapist facing ethics violations, regarding confidentiality, we're conducting an internal review of his cases. I understand completely, I replied. Would it be helpful if I limited my consulting involvement during this period? Actually, Thomas continued, the committee feels your professional expertise is particularly valuable right now. We're implementing new confidentiality protocols across the firm, and your perspective would be beneficial in that process. The yucky irony was unmistakable. I was being invited to help develop confidentiality measures prompted by concerns about Daniel's relationship with Sophia. This development would inevitably increase his professional isolation within the firm, while simultaneously elevating my professional standing. Social escalation followed a different but equally potent trajectory. 3 months after our encounter at Bellini's, the annual benefit for the Children's Hospital, an event where Daniel and I had always been featured patrons, approached. Historically, our table had included close friends and key professional connections, with Daniel serving on the host committee for the past 5 years. This year, I received not only an invitation but a personal call from Victoria Harrington, the benefit chair and wife of the hospital board president. Allison, we'd be honored if you would join the host committee this year, she said. Your contributions to the hospital's family counseling program have been invaluable. The offer represented a significant social statement. Not only was I still welcome in this prestigious circle, but I was being elevated to a position previously held by Daniel. My acceptance was measured and gracious, focused on the charitable mission rather than the social implications. Daniel and Sophia's response to these escalating pressures revealed growing fissures in their relationship. Through my carefully maintained network of information sources, I learned that they had canceled their planned weekend trip to the Vineyard Estate, where Daniel had originally intended to propose to Sophia. More tellingly, she had been seen having intense conversations with her attorney, not Harrison Wells, but Marjorie Severin, a specialist in professional licensing defense. The most visible evidence of escalation came during the quarterly meeting of the city's Mental Health Coalition, where both Sophia and I served on different committees. The scheduling created an unavoidable professional encounter, our first direct interaction in a public setting since the discovery at Bellini's. Arrived early, deliberately choosing a seat that would make her entrance awkward regardless of where she positioned herself. When Sophia finally appeared, 15 minutes late, the room's subtle reaction was palpable. Cooling smiles, minimal acknowledgments, the slight shifting of bodies to create social distance. During the committee reports, I presented my update on ethical training initiatives with professional composure, making eye contact with every member except Sophia. When her turn came to present the community outreach report, her usually confident delivery was hesitant, her voice slightly unsteady as she rushed through her presentation. The meeting's coffee break created the inevitable moment of direct contact. As I stood by the refreshment table, Sophia approached, her expression carefully composed. "Allison," she said, her voice low. "This has gone far enough. The ethics investigation is based on misunderstood communications. You know that." I maintained the calm, slightly puzzled expression I had practiced for this moment. "The ethics committee operates independently, Sophia. If there's been a misunderstanding, I'm sure the review process will clarify matters." "This isn't about ethics," she hissed, her composed facade cracking slightly. "This is about punishment. You're systematically destroying my practice." "That's an interesting interpretation," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. "Though it suggests you believe your practice could be destroyed by an examination of your professional conduct. That seems concerning." Her face flushed as several colleagues glanced our way. "Daniel was right about you," she said. "There's a coldness we never saw before. Perhaps you simply never looked closely enough," I responded with the same measured tone. "Observation was supposed to be your professional specialty, after all." I moved away then, leaving her standing alone by the coffee service. Our brief exchange noticed by enough colleagues to ensure it would circulate through professional circles with all the interpretive embellishments such retellings inevitably acquire. The escalation continued through financial channels as well. The expedited divorce settlement had been finalized on terms highly favorable to me, including full ownership of our primary residence, which I promptly listed for sale. The real estate market was strong, and the property sold within weeks for significantly above asking price. This financial windfall coincided with Daniel's increased expenses. The ethics investigation had required Sophia to reduce her client load, impacting her income while her legal expenses mounted. Meanwhile, Daniel's position at the firm remained secure but increasingly isolated, with new client assignments noticeably reduced. Their financial pressure became publicly visible when Sophia's planned office expansion was abruptly canceled, and the luxury car Daniel had purchased following. Our separation was replaced with a more modest model. These visible adjustments to their lifestyle created additional social ripples, generating speculation about their financial stability. Throughout this escalation phase, I maintained my strategic distance, allowing natural consequences to unfold without direct intervention. My public focus remained on rebuilding my independent professional identity, accepting a visiting lecturer position at the university's psychology department, publishing a well-received article on therapeutic boundaries in a prestigious journal, and expanding my volunteer work with trauma survivors. This deliberate focus on constructive professional activities provided stark contrast to Daniel and Sophia's increasingly defensive posture. While they expended emotional and financial resources managing the escalating consequences of their actions, I appeared to be moving forward with purpose and dignity. The most significant development came unexpectedly, through Rachel's connections in the legal community. Daniel had been passed over for the junior partnership that had been all but guaranteed before our separation. The official explanation cited changing firm priorities, but the unofficial word suggested concerns about judgment and potential client complications related to Sophia's ethics investigation. This professional setback represented the most damaging escalation yet. Not just a temporary embarrassment, but a career trajectory permanently altered. The partnership Daniel had spent years positioning himself to secure had slipped beyond his reach, not through my direct action, but through the natural consequences of his own choices amplified by the professional environment I had carefully influenced. As this escalation phase reached its peak, I recognized that the momentum now carried sufficient force to continue without my active guidance. The dominoes were falling in sequence, each impact triggering the next with increasing velocity. What had begun as a controlled, strategic response to betrayal had evolved into a self-sustaining cascade of consequences that would continue to unfold regardless of my further actions. The escalation had taken on a life of its own, driven now by the social and professional ecosystems I had methodically prepared. By the 6-month mark following my discovery at Bellini's, the various strands of consequence I had set in motion began to intertwine and accelerate, creating a self-perpetuating chain reaction that required minimal further intervention from me. Like a master puppeteer who can step back once the strings are properly tensioned, I watched as the mechanism I had designed operated with its own momentum. The ethics investigation into Sophia's practice expanded beyond the initial confidentiality concerns to include broader boundary violations. What began as specific questions about her relationship with Daniel while treating his clients' spouses evolved into a comprehensive review of her practice management. The committee's preliminary findings led to a formal hearing scheduled for the following month, a serious escalation that threatened not just her reputation, but potentially her license. The evidence threshold for formal hearings is substantial, Eleanor explained during one of our regular committee meetings, careful not to directly reference Sophia's case while still conveying its significance. The board only proceeds when the preliminary investigation indicates patterns rather than isolated incidents. This professional crisis created immediate ripple effects through Sophia's practice. Medical insurance providers, noting the pending ethics investigation, placed her provider status under review. This administrative designation meant delayed reimbursements and additional documentation requirements, bureaucratic complications that further strained her already reduced client practice. Daniel's professional situation deteriorated in parallel, though through different mechanisms. The partners at Reynolds and Whitman had implemented new client confidentiality protocols I had helped design as a consultant, requiring additional disclosures about personal relationships that might create conflicts of interest. These new requirements placed Daniel in the uncomfortable position of having to formally document his relationship with a therapist under ethics investigation. The disclosure forms have created quite a stir, Thomas Whitman mentioned during our monthly consulting meeting, particularly for anyone with connections to mental health professionals who might have access to client family information. See? Statement, while not directly referencing Daniel, clearly indicated how the new protocols had institutionalized the exact concerns raised by his relationship with Sophia. What had been a personal indiscretion was now codified as a professional liability, one that affected his standing with both colleagues and clients. These professional pressures inevitably transferred to their personal relationship. Through my carefully maintained information network, I learned that Daniel had moved out of Sophia's condominium into a downtown apartment. They still appeared together at occasional events, but their body language had shifted from the confident intimacy of new lovers to the tense proximity of business partners navigating a failing venture. The most visible evidence of their deteriorating relationship came during the hospital benefit where I now served on the host committee. Daniel attended alone, explaining Sophia's absence as due to professional commitments, a thin excuse immediately recognized as face-saving by the socially perceptive audience. Throughout the evening, he maintained the polished charm that had once seemed so natural but now appeared increasingly performative. Our inevitable encounter came during the pre-dinner reception. I was engaged in conversation with the hospital board president when Daniel approached, social etiquette requiring an acknowledgement that neither of us could avoid. "Allison?" He nodded, his expression carefully neutral. "The event looks wonderful. Congratulations on your committee work." "Thank you, Daniel," I replied with professional courtesy. "The children's program is certainly worth supporting." The brief exchange was unremarkable in content, but loaded with subtext visible to the attendees who witnessed it. My composed dignity contrasted with his barely concealed discomfort, creating an unspoken narrative that required no elaboration. Later that evening, I overheard fragments of conversation between Daniel and Martin Chen, whose wife had been among the first clients to leave Sophia's practice. "Difficult to maintain certain professional relationships under the circumstances," Martin was saying, his tone apologetic but firm. "The firm needs to consider potential liability issues." Daniel's response was too low to hear clearly, but his expression revealed the message's impact. Another client relationship damaged by the cascading consequences of his personal choices. Chain reaction extended beyond professional spheres into financial realms. The expedited divorce settlement had secured my financial independence, including substantial liquid assets that I now invested in a lakefront property adjacent to my parents' cabin. This expansion created a peaceful compound that symbolized my growing independence and future-focused perspective. Meanwhile, financial pressures mounted for both Daniel and Sophia. Her reduced client load and increasing legal expenses created cash flow challenges evident in her decision to cancel her annual professional conference presentations, events she had previously leveraged for practice development. Daniel's financial strain became visible when he listed his membership in the exclusive Hawthorne Club for sale, a significant social indicator in our circles. These financial adjustments created their own narrative momentum. What had begun as the story of a betrayed wife had evolved into a cautionary tale about professional and financial consequences. In social conversations where their situation arose, the focus had shifted from emotional drama to practical implications. How Sophia's practice might survive the ethics investigation, whether Daniel could rebuild client relationships damaged by association. The most revealing development came through an unexpected channel. Jessica, my source at Daniel's firm, shared information that perfectly illustrated how thoroughly the chain reaction had transformed perceptions. "The summer associate program starts next month," she mentioned during one of our coffee meetings. Several of the female associates specifically requested not to be assigned to Daniel's team. They're concerned about his judgment regarding women in professional settings. This development represented a profound shift in how Daniel was perceived within his professional community. What had been viewed initially as a personal matter, leaving his wife for her friend, had evolved into concerns about his professional treatment of women generally. The reputational damage had generalized beyond our specific situation into broader questions about his character. Sophia experienced a similar reputational transformation. The ethics investigation had created professional wariness that extended beyond current circumstances to retrospective questioning of her previous practices. Former colleagues now recalled concerning comments or boundary issues they had previously dismissed, a revisionist perspective that further isolated her professionally. Throughout this chain reaction phase, I maintained my established posture of dignified focus on my own professional development. I accepted an invitation to contribute to a textbook on therapeutic ethics, expanded my university teaching to include a graduate seminar, and continued my strategic involvement with professional committees. This forward momentum created its own positive feedback loop. Each professional accomplishment generated new opportunities, each committee contribution expanded my influence, and each measured public appearance reinforced the narrative of resilience and ethical fortitude that now defined my public identity. The contrast between our respective trajectories became increasingly stark. While I appeared to be building a stronger professional foundation, Daniel and Sophia seemed caught in an accelerating downward spiral, each setback creating new vulnerabilities that led to further complications. This divergence was perhaps most visible in our respective social positioning. Invitations that had once included Daniel and me as a couple now came addressed solely to me, while events that had previously featured Sophia prominently now conspicuously omitted her. The social ecosystem had reorganized itself around new understanding of relative standing and association value. The chain reaction had now developed sufficient momentum to be self-sustaining, each consequence triggering new complications that required no further initiation from me. My role had shifted from active strategist to observant witness as the mechanism I had designed operated with its own internal logic. Daniel and Sophia had launched their relationship believing they controlled the narrative, that their happiness justified whatever pain they caused in its pursuit. Now they found themselves caught in a story they no longer authored, responding to plot developments they hadn't anticipated and couldn't control. As this phase reached its conclusion, I recognized that we had reached a critical threshold, the point where external pressure would soon force a more direct confrontation. The next development would inevitably bring us to a moment of truth, where pretense and social positioning would give way to raw reality. The chain reaction was approaching, its logical conclusion. The moment of reckoning was coming. 7 months after the night at Bellini's, events accelerated toward a decisive turning point. The careful groundwork I had laid, the strategic alliances I had formed, and the measured actions I had taken all converged to create a moment from which there could be no retreat. For any of us. The catalyst came in the form of the Ethics Committee's formal hearing regarding Sophia's professional conduct. After weeks of preliminary investigation, the committee scheduled a full review with potential disciplinary consequences. While such proceedings were typically confidential, the professional community's size ensured that news of the hearing circulated widely. Sophia's response to this pressure revealed how thoroughly her position had deteriorated. Rather than maintaining the composed professional demeanor that had defined her career, she sent a late-night email to several colleagues, including Eleanor Winters, alleging that the investigation was motivated by personal vendetta rather than legitimate ethical concerns. She specifically named you as orchestrating a campaign against her, Eleanor informed me during a carefully discreet call. The committee considers this response concerning in itself, attempting to discredit the review process rather than addressing the substantive issues. This desperate communication represented a significant miscalculation. By explicitly connecting the ethics investigation to me, Sophia had transformed what had been a professional review into a personal accusation, undermining her own credibility, while reinforcing the perception of poor professional judgment. Daniel's point of no return arrived through different circumstances, but with similar gravity. The firm's management committee, concerned about potential liability issues related to client confidentiality, implemented a new conflict management protocol that directly impacted his position. The policy requires immediate disclosure of any personal relationship that could create information vulnerabilities, Thomas explained during a consultation meeting where I was reviewing the new guidelines. Additionally, attorneys with such potential conflicts will be reassigned from cases involving affected client families. The policy, while applicable to all attorneys at the firm, had been clearly designed to address the specific scenario Daniel had created. Its implementation would require him to formally document his relationship with Sophia and potentially surrender several key client relationships, a professional humiliation that would permanently alter his standing at the firm. These simultaneous professional crises created unbearable strain on their personal relationship. Through Rachel's connections, I learned that Daniel and Sophia had engaged in a public argument at a downtown restaurant, their heated exchange drawing attention from other diners before they abruptly departed separately. The breaking point became publicly visible the following week. Daniel attended a crucial client dinner alone, and when asked about Sophia's absence, he responded with a terse, "We're taking some time to focus on our separate professional situations." This diplomatic phrasing couldn't disguise the reality. Their relationship was fracturing under the weight of consequences neither had anticipated. My own point of no return arrived unexpectedly. During a therapy session with a long-term client, struggling with trust issues, I found myself drawing on my personal experience in ways I had previously avoided. Sometimes betrayal reveals truths we needed to see, I said, the insight emerging from my own journey rather than textbook therapeutic principles. It forces us to recognize patterns we've been blind to and rebuild on more authentic foundations. This moment of genuine connection, using my own transformed understanding to help another's healing, marked a profound shift in my professional approach. The experience I had navigated was becoming not just a personal trial to overcome, but a source of deeper insight that enhanced my therapeutic effectiveness. This realization represented my own threshold crossing. I was no longer merely responding to betrayal, but had integrated that experience into a stronger, more authentic professional identity. The strategic actions I had taken weren't just about consequences for Daniel and Sophia. They were about reclaiming and redefining my own path forward. The convergence of these separate points of no return created an inescapable momentum. Daniel now faced career-altering choices about disclosures that would permanently affect his professional standing. Sophia confronted an ethics hearing that threatened her licensure and practice viability. I stood at the threshold of a professional approach that incorporated rather than compartmentalized my personal experience. None of us could retreat from these positions. The carefully constructed social facades had crumbled, revealing the underlying truths that had been present all along. Daniel's willingness to sacrifice professional integrity for personal desire, Sophia's disregard for therapeutic boundaries, and my own capacity for strategic resilience, neither of them had recognized. The final evidence that we had crossed a decisive threshold came through an unexpected channel. Daniel's mother, Margaret Reynolds, a woman who had treated me with cordial distance throughout our marriage, reached out with a request to meet. Over tea at a quiet cafe far from our usual social circuits, she surprised me with her directness. "I owe you an apology, Allison," she said, her usual reserve softened by what appeared to be genuine regret. "I didn't see what was happening, and when it became clear, I didn't respond as I should have." Her acknowledgement represented more than personal reconciliation. It signaled a fundamental shift in how our situation was perceived even within Daniel's family circle. The narrative had definitively transformed. We had all crossed the point of no return. Whatever happened next would unfold on entirely new terrain, where old assumptions and expectations no longer applied. The reckoning had arrived. The inevitable confrontation came on a rain-soaked Tuesday evening, 8 months after the night at Bellini's. I had just returned to the lake house after teaching my graduate seminar when headlights swept across my windows, an unexpected visitor navigating the winding road to my secluded property. Daniel stood on my porch, rain dripping from his expensive coat, his appearance markedly different from the confident attorney who had once shared my life. The additional weight he'd lost gave his face a gaunt quality, and the shadows beneath his eyes spoke of ongoing sleep deprivation. "We need to talk, Allison," he said, his voice carrying an edge of desperation that contrasted sharply with his usual controlled demeanor. "This has gone far enough." I assessed him calmly, noting the symbolic significance of his arrival at my threshold, seeking me out in the space I had deliberately established beyond his reach. "Come in," I said finally, stepping aside. "You're getting soaked." Inside, the lake house reflected my evolution over the past months. Professional books and papers sharing space with artwork I'd begun collecting, evidence of a life expanding beyond the boundaries of our former relationship. Daniel took in these changes with a quick, assessing glance before turning back to me. "The Ethics Committee has scheduled Sophia's formal hearing," he began without preamble. "Her attorney believes disbarment is a real possibility." I moved to the kitchen, putting the kettle on with deliberate composure. "The committee makes its own determinations based on evidence. I'm not involved in their disciplinary process." "Not directly," he countered, following me. "But we both know this started with you. The initial inquiry, the strategic connections. With Eleanor Winters, the carefully placed concerns about confidentiality breaches." I turned to face him, maintaining my measured calm. "What started this, Daniel, was your and Sophia's decision to betray my trust, both personal and professional. The ethics inquiry began because actual ethical violations occurred." The kettle whistled, and I prepared 2 cups of tea with methodical precision, using the familiar ritual to maintain emotional distance. When I handed him a cup, in the blue, stoneware he had always disliked, he accepted it automatically, his focus entirely on formulating his next approach. "The firm has implemented new conflict protocols," he continued, changing tactics. "I've been removed from 3 major client accounts and passed over for the Mitchell acquisition team. My career trajectory has been effectively derailed. Professional consequences often follow ethical lapses, I observed, taking a seat in the living room where the rain-streaked windows reflected our images against the darkness outside. That seems like a natural progression rather than an orchestrated outcome. Frustration flashed across his face. This systematic dismantling of our lives goes far beyond natural consequences, Allison. The coordinated pressure on multiple fronts, the strategic timing, the perfect targeting of our professional vulnerabilities, it's all too precise to be coincidental. An interesting perspective, I replied, though it suggests a level of calculation. You never recognized in me during our marriage. That observation landed with visible impact. Daniel set down his untouched tea, moving to stand by the window where rain continued to beat against the glass. For several moments he remained silent, seemingly reassessing both his approach and his understanding of the woman he had once married. Sophia and I have ended our relationship, he said finally, the admission carrying a weight that filled the room. The professional and social pressure became too damaging to sustain. I absorbed this information without visible reaction, though it represented the inevitable outcome I had anticipated. I'm sorry it didn't work out, I said, the conventional response highlighting the unconventional circumstances that surrounded us. He turned from the window, studying me with newfound wariness. Are you? Sorry? I'm sorry you sacrificed your integrity, damaged your career, and hurt people who trusted you for a relationship that ultimately failed, I clarified. That seems like a tragic miscalculation. His composed facade cracked further. Is that what this has all been about? Making sure we suffered enough to satisfy your sense of justice? This hasn't been about making you suffer, Daniel, I replied, maintaining my calm certainty. It's been about ensuring you experience the full consequences of your choices. There's a significant difference. Semantics, he countered, anger briefly overtaking calculation. You've systematically destroyed everything we built. No? I interrupted, my voice finally carrying an edge of the cold precision that had guided my actions these past months. You and Sophia destroyed what we built when you chose betrayal over honesty. What I've done is ensure that comfortable illusions didn't shield you from the natural outcomes of those choices. The stark truth of this statement hung between us, undeniable in its accuracy. Daniel moved back to the couch, sinking into it with the physical concession of a man recognizing defeat. What happens now? He asked, his voice holding genuine uncertainty for perhaps the first time in our long association. Is this where it ends? Now that you've won? I considered his question carefully, recognizing its significance beyond the immediate moment. This was never about winning, Daniel. It was about reclaiming my agency after you and Sophia attempted to script my role in your narrative. What happens now is that we all move forward with clearer understanding of actions and consequences. That's it? Disbelief colored his tone. After methodically dismantling our professional and personal lives, you're simply moving on. I moved on the night I walked out of Bellini's, I corrected him. Everything since then has been about ensuring the story reached its appropriate conclusion rather than the convenient ending you and Sophia had planned. Rain continued to drum against the windows, the rhythm underscoring the finality of our exchange. Daniel remained seated, seemingly unable to formulate a response that could bridge the chasm of understanding that now separated us. I never really knew you, he said finally, the realization seemingly genuine. No, I agreed, the simple truth requiring no elaboration. You didn't. Daniel left the lake house that night without further arguments, his departure marked by a strange combination of resignation and bewilderment. As his headlights disappeared down the winding road, I stood at the window feeling neither triumph nor remorse, only the quiet certainty that a necessary chapter had reached its conclusion. The following Weeks brought the formal resolution of the various threads I had carefully managed over the preceding months. The ethics committee held Sophia's hearing as scheduled, resulting in a 1-year suspension of her clinical license with mandatory supervision upon reinstatement. This outcome, while serious, stopped short of permanent disbarment, a measured consequence that reflected professional accountability without vindictive excess. Daniel's professional situation stabilized into a new reality. He retained his position at Reynolds and Whitman, but with a significantly altered status. The prestigious client relationships and partnership track that had defined his career trajectory were replaced by more limited responsibilities and reduced visibility. He had become, as Thomas Whitman delicately phrased it during our final consulting meeting, a cautionary example of personal choices affecting professional standing. Our divorce had been legally finalized months earlier, but the emotional disconnection reached completion only after our confrontation at the lake house. The remaining practical matters, final property transfers and administrative details, were handled through attorneys with businesslike efficiency. The last document requiring my signature arrived on a bright spring morning, 10 months after the night at Bellini's. As I signed my name, I recognized the symmetry of the moment. The relationship that had begun with formal documentation ended the same way, the emotional content distilled to legal language and notarized acknowledgments. Sophia's resolution took a different form. Following her license suspension, she left the city entirely, relocating to the West Coast where her sister lived. Through professional circles, I heard she had accepted a position in corporate coaching, a role that utilized her interpersonal skills without the clinical responsibilities and ethical requirements of therapeutic practice. The social ecosystem that had once defined our intertwined lives reorganized around these new realities. Mutual friends who had initially maintained connections with both sides gradually shifted toward natural alignments. Some relationships faded completely, while others transformed into deeper connections based on authentic understanding rather than social convenience. My professional life continued its evolution, strengthened rather than diminished by the experience. The university offered me a permanent position leading the ethics curriculum for clinical psychology students. My private practice, which I had maintained on a limited basis throughout this period, expanded with a new focus on helping clients navigate major life transitions with strategic resilience. Most significantly, I completed the manuscript for a book examining the psychology of betrayal and recovery from a clinical perspective, incorporating research and anonymized case studies that transformed personal experience into professional insight. The publisher's enthusiastic response confirmed that my journey had value beyond personal resolution. The true resolution, however, came not through external outcomes, but through internal integration. The woman who had discovered her husband's betrayal at Bellini's restaurant had been irrevocably changed, not destroyed as they might have expected, nor hardened into bitterness as might have been feared, but transformed into someone with deeper understanding of both human vulnerability and personal capacity. As spring blossomed around the lake house, I recognized that the carefully orchestrated consequences I had set in motion had served their purpose. The resolution wasn't about Daniel and Sophia's specific fates, but about restoring balance to a narrative they had attempted to control. The story had reached its proper conclusion. Not the one they had planned, but the one their actions had ultimately deserved. 1 year after the night at Bellini's, I found myself sitting on the dock at the lake house, watching the sunset paint golden ripples across the water. The expanded property now included a small writing cabin where I'd completed my manuscript and begun preliminary work on a second book. The anniversary hadn't escaped my notice, though it no longer carried the emotional charge it once might have. Rachel joined me that evening, bringing wine and the comfortable silence of a relationship that required no performative conversation. After several minutes watching the changing colors on the water, she finally asked the question she'd been holding back for months. "Do you ever regret how thoroughly you dismantled their lives? Not that they didn't deserve consequences, but the systematic way you approached it. I considered her question carefully, recognizing its legitimacy. The strategic precision with which I had approached the aftermath of betrayal differed significantly from how most people processed such trauma. I don't regret ensuring they experienced appropriate consequences, I replied finally. But I've reflected extensively on my motivations and methods. There's a fine line between justice and vengeance, between holding someone accountable and becoming defined by that pursuit. Rachel nodded, understanding the distinction. And where did you fall on that line, looking back now? The question deserved honest examination. I had maintained professional ethics throughout, never fabricating evidence or making false accusations. Everything that had befallen Daniel and Sophia stemmed directly from their own actions and choices. Yet the calculated nature of my response revealed aspects of myself that warranted reflection. I believe I maintained the ethical boundaries, I said slowly. Every consequence connected directly to actual violations or legitimate concerns. But the strategic thoroughness, the way I approached it like solving a complex problem rather than processing an emotional wound, that revealed something about me I'm still integrating into my self-understanding. We sat with that acknowledgement. As darkness gradually claimed the lake, stars beginning to appear in the clear evening sky. The psychologist in me recognized the importance of this reflection, not to generate guilt or second-guessing, but to fully process an experience that had fundamentally shifted my understanding of myself. The most surprising outcome, I continued after several minutes, wasn't what happened to them. It was discovering my own capacity for strategic thinking under emotional pressure. That revelation has changed how I approach both my professional work and personal challenges. Rachel smiled slightly. I always knew you had that steel core beneath the empathetic therapist exterior. Daniel just never bothered to look deeply enough to see it. Her observation captured an essential truth. Daniel and Sophia had constructed their betrayal around a fundamental misunderstanding of who I was, assuming that my compassionate professional approach indicated malleability or passivity in personal matters. Their miscalculation had proven costly. In the months since our confrontation at the lake house, I had occasional updates about their separate lives through mutual connections. Daniel had begun rebuilding his practice with more modest ambitions, focusing on corporate compliance rather than high-profile acquisitions. Sophia had completed additional ethics training as required by her suspension terms and was working in a supervised capacity on the West Coast. These developments brought neither satisfaction nor disappointment, only a sense of appropriate resolution. They were living with the natural consequences of their choices, just as I was living with the transformative impact of my response to those choices. The experience changed me, I acknowledged to Rachel, as nightfall completed its claim on the Saw day. Not in the way they might have anticipated when they planned their announcement at my birthday party, but perhaps in ways I needed to discover about myself. That night, reflecting alone after Rachel departed, I recognized that the true value of the past year lay not in the consequences others had experienced, but in my own evolution. I had discovered capacities for strategic thinking, emotional resilience, and principled determination that might have remained dormant without the catalyst of betrayal. The reflection wasn't about them anymore. It was about the woman who had emerged from that crucible, stronger, clearer, and more authentically herself than ever before. 18 months after discovering Daniel and Sophia at Bellini's, the transformation that had begun in that moment of betrayal reached its fullest expression. The changes weren't merely circumstantial: new home, expanded professional opportunities, altered social connections, but fundamental shifts in how I understood myself and navigated the world. The most visible transformation manifested in my professional life. My book on strategic resilience following betrayal had been published to critical acclaim and strong sales, positioning me as a thought leader in a specialized therapeutic niche. Universities and professional organizations regularly requested lectures and workshops, creating opportunities to translate personal insight into broader clinical applications. Your approach challenges conventional wisdom about processing betrayal, noted a respected colleague after my keynote address at a psychology conference. The integration of strategic thinking with emotional healing offers a powerful alternative to traditional recovery models. This professional evolution stemmed directly from my own experience, not despite the betrayal, but because of how I had chosen to navigate its aftermath. The strategic precision that had guided my response to Daniel and Sophia had transformed into a therapeutic methodology that helped others reclaim agency in their own recovery processes. My private practice evolved, accordingly, attracting clients specifically seeking guidance through complex relationship transitions. These therapeutic relationships differed significantly from my previous work, less focused on open-ended emotional exploration and more structured around strategic assessment and purposeful action. You've helped me understand that responding to betrayal isn't just about processing feelings, one client reflected during our final session. It's about making conscious choices about what happens next, rather than just reacting to what happened before. The personal transformation ran deeper still. The woman who had once unconsciously adapted to Daniel's preferences and accommodated Sophia's friendship had been replaced by someone with clearer boundaries and more authentic self-expression. This evolution manifested in everything from my living environment, designed entirely around my preferences rather than compromises, to my more selective approach to relationships of all kinds. Perhaps most significantly, I developed a more nuanced understanding of forgiveness that transcended conventional expectations. Traditional narratives suggested that healing required either bitter resentment or complete forgiveness. My experience revealed a more complex truth. I had neither forgotten nor excused what Daniel and Sophia had done, but I had integrated that experience into a coherent life narrative that no longer required emotional energy to maintain. Their actions had become historical facts, rather than active wounds, relevant to my story but no longer central to my identity. This transformation became most apparent during an unexpected encounter at a professional conference in Chicago. Entering a hotel restaurant for breakfast, I found myself face-to-face with Sophia, who had apparently completed her supervision requirements and resumed limited practice. The moment held none of the emotional charge that might have existed months earlier. We acknowledged each other with civil nods, neither seeking further interaction nor attempting to avoid it. Later that day, we participated in the same panel discussion, engaging professionally without personal reference or underlying tension. What struck me most about this encounter was its ordinariness, the absence of both animosity and anxiety. Sophia had become simply another professional colleague with whom I shared complicated history, neither an enemy to be avoided nor a relationship to be reconciled. This emotional equilibrium represented the most profound aspect of my transformation. The strategic response I had implemented wasn't ultimately about consequences for them, but about reclaiming personal agency for myself. The calculated precision that had guided my actions had created not just external changes in circumstances, but internal shifts in self-perception. In quiet moments of honest reflection, I recognized that the betrayal had catalyzed a necessary evolution. The woman who had stood shocked in Bellini's restaurant watching her husband kiss her best friend had been transformed, not destroyed as they might have expected, not merely surviving as she might have hoped, but fundamentally reconstructed into someone stronger, clearer, and more authentically herself. The transformation wasn't about who they had revealed themselves to be, but about who I had discovered myself to be in response. That was the unexpected gift hidden within betrayal's painful packaging, the opportunity to rebuild not just circumstances, but self-understanding on foundations of newfound strength and clarity. 2 years after the night at Bellini's, I stood on the expanded deck of my lakeside property, watching guests arrive for the housewarming celebration. The renovation had transformed the modest cabin into a spacious retreat that perfectly balanced professional functionality with personal comfort. I physical manifestation of the new life I had built. The guest list reflected how thoroughly my social world had evolved. Rachel and Michael were there, of course, their unwavering support having deepened our connection beyond family obligation to genuine friendship. Professional colleagues with whom casual associations had grown into meaningful relationships mingled with new friends who knew me only as I was now, not as I had been in my previous life. "This place is perfect for you," observed Eleanor Winters, now a close friend beyond our professional collaboration. "It reflects your essence in a way your old house never did." Her observation captured an essential truth. The home I had shared with Daniel had always represented compromise and adaptation, while this space expressed authentic preferences and priorities without dilution. As twilight settled over the lake, I found myself in conversation with James Calloway, the architect, who had helped design the renovation. Our professional relationship had gradually evolved into something more personal over the months of collaboration, revealing a connection neither of us had initially sought, but both now valued. "I've been meaning to ask," he said, his voice carrying the thoughtful tone I'd come to appreciate. "Do you ever miss your old life? The certainty of it, I mean." I considered his question as we watched the sunset reflect across the water. "I don't miss the certainty that came from compromise and accommodation," I replied finally. "What I've built now may have emerged from unexpected circumstances, but it's authentically mine in ways my previous life never was." James nodded, understanding the distinction. Sometimes the most destructive moments create the clearest opportunities for reconstruction. Later that evening, after guests had departed and quiet had reclaimed the property, I sat alone on the dock, reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this moment. The methodical dismantling of Daniel and Sophia's carefully planned future hadn't ultimately been about justice or consequences, though those elements were present, but about reclaiming authorship of my own story. The complete resolution wasn't found in their separate fates, though both had eventually stabilized into diminished versions of their former aspirations. Daniel had recently accepted a position at a smaller firm, stepping away from the prestige and pressure of his previous trajectory. Sophia had rebuilt a modest practice focused on corporate consultation rather than individual therapy, her professional reputation permanently altered but not entirely destroyed. The true resolution, the genuine new beginning, existed in the life I had consciously constructed from betrayal's aftermath. The expanded professional opportunities, the deeper personal insights, the more authentic relationships, all emerged not despite the traumatic catalyst, but through my deliberate response to it. My phone chimed with a message from my publisher confirming the contract for my second book. This project would extend beyond betrayal recovery into broader applications of strategic resilience across life transitions, an evolution that paralleled my own journey from focused response to expanded perspective. As night settled completely over the lake, stars reflected in the still water, I recognized the symmetry of moments, how the ending that began at Bellini's had ultimately created a beginning I couldn't have imagined that night. The new chapter wasn't defined by what had been lost or taken, but by what had been discovered and created. The future stretched before me not as a reaction to betrayal, but as an authentic expression of who I had always been beneath the accommodations and compromises, stronger, clearer, and finally, completely my own. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.